Hey, welcome to Audiobooks All Day. And today we have an excellent book to talk about, and that is The Time Machine.
Nice intro. That was perfect.
Well, I don't you're supposed, you're supposed to tell more about the book. I didn't want to take any of your thunder.
No, well, Thunder will never be taken. The Time Machine is another one of these late 1800s novellas done by H.G. Wells, one of my faves. I am consistently amazed how he can do science fiction and horror, and just kind of bounce back between the two. This one to me is just honestly a little bit of both. This one focuses so much on what humanity means and where we're all going. But H.G. Wells had a great, thought here, and I have never, in my expectation of this book, I kind of thought we were doing a Back to the Future. When I first saw The Time Machine, I thought this was going to be a Back to the Future kind of thing where you travel back in time and maybe forward in time. You'd see things. I didn't really know what it was about, but this is a heavy book. This is a book that makes you think. If you give to this book, you will get so much more. And that's why I had to listen to it, 1.5 times. I didn't quite make it through the whole thing the second time, but it's a lot, and I wasn't ready for it, mainly because I had just come off The Invisible Man, and I love The Invisible Man, but it really didn't take much to engage. It was just a story, and I followed it, and it was fun, and I loved it. This one though, I had to put some thought into. I really had to engage, and it was very worth it. The effort was worth it. And so, yeah, Time Machine by H.G. Wells, excited to hop in.
So, The Time Machine, so what happens is you're at a dinner party, and the host hasn't arrived yet. And eventually, he busts in, and he's not wearing any shoes, and he's all tattered. And he's like, give me a minute. Goes up, gets changed, comes back down, eats. And then everyone's like, well, what's wrong? What happened? He's like, all right, sit down. I'm going to tell you a story. Don't ask any questions. And he starts to tell this story of how he just got back from the future, how he built a time machine, how he went to the year 802,701. He met these two races called the Eloi and the Murlocs. And then how he went 30 million years into the future and witnessed the death of the earth and the sun and the cold grasp of infinity.
That would be a pretty wild dinner. And that is something that I kind of like about his books, is that he just kind of like hops right in. It's like, hey, and then here's this crazy scenario, by the way. And there's always this element in his books of somebody telling somebody something that they don't believe. Like I think of, the guy who gets rescued after Dr. Moreau, and he just feels isolated from the world after his experiences. This is totally the person, the time traveler, who does not have a name. They never actually name this dude in the book, which is kind of classic H.G. Wells, where he doesn't name all of his characters. I mainly think of in The War of the Worlds, with the main character there. Anyways, I thought that it was really interesting how the main characters that go through, they have these supernatural experiences, and those amazing experiences actually ostracize them from everybody because nobody can relate, nobody believes them. And so in the case of the island of Dr. Moreau, that person just goes to the country and just finds solace in gardening. But in this one, the person finds so much discontent after this incredible experience that we'll get into that he winds up just leaving and just going to the future. So as Kevin mentioned, when he goes into this really distant future, there's only two groups of people. And initially when he goes and he meets the Eloi, he's like, wow, we have made it as a human species. Look, it's peaceful. All of these people just seem to be doing super well. And then what you start, and by the way, I don't know what Kevin, from the description of the book, how humanoid were the Eloi to you?
I kind of imagine them as little tiny kind of furry humanoids, like the size of children. And that's kind of one of the things that, he gets to these people, and they are, he's a scientist, right? I'm going to go to the future, and I'm going to see the wonders of science. I'm going to see us progress in such a dramatic way. And he doesn't take a gun. He doesn't take a lot of supplies. He just goes and he's like, I'm just going to go to the future and check out science. And when he gets to the future, he finds out that you have the Eloi which are actually, they don't really have any technology, but they also don't have any sickness. They don't have any war. They don't have any discontent. And he's sitting there thinking, this must be the end game for humanity. We overcome, social strife. We overcome disease. We overcome all this stuff. And we revert back because we no longer, I think he says the quote, conflict is, man, it's something that, strife is the whetstone on which we are sharpened. And the basic idea is just that when we no longer have conflict, we revert to a more natural state.
Yeah, and I thought, all of that was great, and I was like, oh, it's so interesting. Oh, here's all these benefits. But then you realize, like, everything is a lie. And this is where, like, my interest in the book just went, like, this is so interesting, where you really realize that the Mordocks or Murlocs, they are the subterranean people they essentially run the world, and they're these kind of big bestial. They were initially kind of classed. By the way, did you not get Red Rising vibes from this?
Totally got Red Rising vibes.
I was like, this is literally Red Rising. I mean, not really, because in this case, the Eloi are actually just really food for the Morlocks. And Morlocks, my gosh. And the Morlocks, they truly kind of run the world, and they're very aggressive, and they just eat the Eloi. And so, you just, for me, it was this really weird thing where all of, the scales kind of fall from your eyes, and you're like, oh my gosh, this world that he's envisioning, it's actually not this way. So that he's getting one perception, but really the Eloi have become so detached from the world. Their life has become so easy that they don't think. They're super weak. They're smaller, kind of like how you were saying. It's just interesting. And the reason why I ask what they look like is, like, the pictures and the old videos and stuff, like, some of them look, it's just interesting, different people's perspectives on what, the Eloi look like versus the Morlocks. I think my favorite version of what the Morlocks look like, I'm going to actually share my screen. Well, because I was just trying to figure it out. I'm like, what do these things look like? Kevin, but check this out. Look at this. This is Morlock town right here. What in the world?
That's terrifying.
Yeah, that's definitely not how I imagine the Morlocks, but
essentially just really kind of weird giant Muppet thing. If you've ever seen The Labyrinth, it's something out of that. And it's funny because the time traveler then starts to hypothesize. Is like, hey, he never really finds out what happens, right? But he starts to hypothesize. I bet that what happened is you had these two classes of people: the people who were allowed to live above ground, who had all the advantages, and the people who lived below ground. And over the thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, they started to morph, and the people above who had no hardship became weak and became meek and became incapable of protecting themselves and became prey, became sheep. And the people below who had, and that's one thing, is that they just live underground and they only come out at night, and especially when there's like an eclipse, and that they've adapted to live underground, but they're in a much harsher society. They eat meat. They don't just eat fruits. They, which is mostly the Eloi. And, they're hunters. They're bigger. They're stronger. They're meaner. And the whole idea is that, he hypothesizes that these class systems have, now flipped on its head, where, it's also just this commentary of, just, this harsh segregation of which, H.G. Wells did see a lot of, in a much more severe class system in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And he also saw in the different societies around him, around World War I and World War II, and all the lead up to that, all the things that were happening in the world, and just really see that, start to be reflected in this book. I feel like.
Yeah. And in the story, he winds up having his time machine moved. And that's definitely like the most scary part of this, is that he gets kind of baited and captured by the Morlocks, actually using the Sphinx, which I thought was kind of interesting. But, that was like, to me, the scariest, right? So you come back to your time machine and it's just not there. That's pretty intense. I think though, what was kind of fun. So he has he kind of meets a friend, Weena, who's an Aloy who helps him, who winds up passing away and kind of sacrificing herself to save him. And when he goes 30 million years kind of into the future to just see what life is like, this is where things get so this is where you kind of like hold up the mirror on yourself and you're like, what is really important? Because literally there's just crab-like creatures on the face of the earth, as the earth is slowly going to, fall apart and get superheated by the sun. And you're just kind of like, wow, like, is that the inevitable? I mean, I suppose it is the inevitable thing of what will eventually happen to the earth after who knows how long. I'm not too sure exactly, but after millions, billions of years, like that is the end state. And how do we defend against that? How do we make our lives more meaningful? How do we not just, have the earth result to kind of like this crab-like form? And I thought it was so interesting, like kind of the arc of humanity, how we essentially started from these small little crustacean things, these small little bacterias, and we kind of end with this crustacean-like creature being the last one on Earth. It was kind of just interesting. And, he's just kind of sitting there looking at it. And then he comes back to his normal time. And then you have everybody else who's just kind of worried about what they're eating for dinner. And, you kind of like lack this worldwide perspective. And that's where I thought the book was so interesting, is it's trying to give you as a reader a perspective on the world and your place in it without forcing an opinion on you. It's not telling you what to think. It's just kind of like it's giving you this person's experience and then you needing to go in and do the work to realize what that is for you. And that's why I really like this book too, is it didn't like end with a specific, here's how you make the world better, or, global warming or war or communism. Like wasn't a direct thing about that. It was more just like humanity. And I was really blown away, and I thought that was super fun. And I think that it actually takes much more discipline to not give you an answer than it does to give you an answer.
Absolutely. And to facilitate a situation where you can draw multiple conclusions. And one of the things that I was really impressed by, and that really what made me think, is thinking about humanity and thinking about, one of the parts that really stuck out to me is, I'd already mentioned it, but how when he went to the future, he was just so taken aback that humanity had, and that's his supposition, that the Eloi and the Murlocs were distant descendant of humanity, and that they had then bifurcated into the two races, but that humanity had regressed in so many ways, the ability to critical think and, essentially reason beyond bestial instincts. And that thinking about humanity as a whole. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the long-term ramifications of humanity, and I would say very few people, outside of maybe Elon Musk, don't spend a lot of time thinking about that. And it made me, it made me think about that and think about, does it matter what humanity is like in the future? Does it matter in 800,000 years what becomes of humanity? Do my actions matter to the long-term impact of humanity? And at least to the last question, I would say that everybody's actions impact humanity as a long-term. And just trying to decide, is that important? Is that important to you? Is that important to us if in 100,000 years humanity was no more? If that we hadn't been able to, fix our Earth and escape, the confines of our planet and start to spread across the galaxy, if we haven't increased in, as a society, in medicine, in technology, in kindness, does that matter? Those are really interesting questions.
Yeah, and I thought too, it's like this thing that H.G. Wells does that is just so great. In his books, sometimes he just leaves things, and I love it. So, for example, there's kind of like this original narrator who's at the party, and then it kind of like reverts back to this narrator at the very end, where, the next day after the dinner party, he goes back to go talk to the time traveler, which is the name of the person throughout the book. And he's prepping for another journey because, before he was only gone for like 3 minutes or something. He goes on this adventure, and when he comes back to the dinner party, he was only gone for like 3 minutes or 3 hours or something. 3 something. But when he gets in, so, he's pretty much saying like, hey, I'm going to be back pretty soon. And then then the narrator, it just ends with the fact he just says, and now it's been 3 years and he still hasn't come back. And I loved that so much. It's like, okay, great. Yeah, he just never came back, and then it just ends, And it's just like, it just gave some sort of random amount of time, like it's been 3 years and he still hasn't come back. I don't know why. I just think that that's great. It's not like this big bow that is put on it. It's not, this big resolution. It's just kind of like it just makes it so much more real to me.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of really early science fiction is that it just kind of stops. It just kind of leaves it there. And with the question of what's next. It's kind of like the old Twilight Zone. Like every episode kind of ended on a what's next? What's happening? And I was thinking about it. I was like, what the concept of time travel, when was it first really instituted? So I was doing some research and trying to figure it out. And I don't have the best answer, but so there were a few books before The Time Machine that did touch on related themes, such as the Memoirs of the 20th Century and The Clock That Went Backwards. The first book in 1733, and then The Clock That Went Backwards was in 1881. But they're not explicitly time travel. Certainly not in the same way, but really the only book before that I could find that had time travel as a theme was A Christmas Carol. But the time travel in that was,
Scrooge went
like
back in he went back in time. Kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. He couldn't interact with the past or the future or really the present. He was a specter. It was more like watching a movie. But that this was really, think how prevalent. How many movies have you seen that have time travel in it in the last 5 years? And the answer is probably like half of them, and which is way overuse of time travel. But that this is like when, that Avengers Endgame would be very different if this book had never been written. And the third Harry Potter would probably be very different if this book were never written. And that's so many things that we just super take for granted. Time travel, it's a thing. This is where the rubber started to meet the road. This is where science fiction said, hey, time travel's a thing, and we can do it through science, and it's a dimension that we can travel just like any other dimension. And that whole concept, just mind-blowing at the time, in the 1890s. And just to think that so many of these books that we're reading are laying the building blocks that we are still playing with today. I can hear you, and I